I want to welcome you tonight to the League of Women Voters of Illinois panel discussion on charter schools. My name is Ann Corder, and I am a member of the Oak Park River Forest League of Women Voters, and I'm co-chair of the state charter study. League members throughout the state are engaged in reaching consensus on what our position should be on charter schools. We want to know how the charter school system should be governed and under what rules it should operate. We're delighted to present 4 distinguished panelists tonight to help us sort through the issues and figure this out. On your left, we have Mr. Kurt Hilgendorf. He's a researcher and legislative activities staffer for the Chicago Teachers Union. He taught history, economics, and psychology at high schools in the Englewood and Albany Park neighborhoods of Chicago. He staffs the School Finance and Taxation Committee of the Chicago Teachers Union. He served on a panel for the Annenberg Institute, which recently completed a study of charter school accountability. Ms. Stacy McAuliffe is the Chief Operating Officer of INCS, the Illinois Network of Charter Schools, a statewide advocacy and charter school support organization serving 134 charter schools in Illinois with more than 55,000 students. Prior to joining INCS, she worked in the Chicago office of the Boston Consulting Group, where her work focused on financial services and public education. Stacy holds an MBA from Northwestern University. Next, Dr. Gary Myron is Professor of Evaluation, Measurement, and Research at Western Michigan University. Over the past 2 decades, he has conducted several studies of school choice programs in Europe and in the United States, including 9 state evaluations of charter school reforms. In recent years, his research has focused on the education management organizations, or EMOs, and efforts to create systemic change in urban schools in Michigan and rural schools in Louisiana. Dr. Myron's degree in international comparative education was earned in Sweden, where he once helped open a charter school. And then last but not least, Dr. Marvin Hoffman recently retired as Associate Director of the University of Chicago Urban Education Institute's Urban Teacher Education Program. Dr. Hoffman holds a PhD in clinical psychology, and he has taught students at all levels from preschool through graduate school. He founded the University of Chicago Charter School in 1998, and it has since expanded to 4 campuses serving 1,750 students. And he recently co-authored a book about starting new schools. In the discussion we are about to enjoy, we will assume that charter schools are here to stay, at least for the time being. So the question is not whether we should have charter schools, but what kind of charter school system we want in Illinois. How can our children and our communities best be served while following the fundamental principles of fairness, transparency, accountability, and fiscal responsibility? There are 4 questions tonight, and each panelist will be given 3 minutes to answer each question. After all have had a chance to weigh in, we will allow 1 more minute to each panelist to respond to the others. So it will go very fast. Marilyn Thomas and Cheryl Chapman will be our timekeepers. After all 4 questions have been addressed, we will collect questions on the index cards that you have. Your questions may be addressed to one panelist or to all of the panelists, and we will collect them after the panel has finished, and we will have some time for questions and answers from the audience. Dr. Jean Pierce will be our moderator. Jean was a professor of educational psychology at Northern Illinois University for 34 years, and she is my co-chair of the state's study. And so now, Jean.
So thank you all for coming tonight. As you know, the program is being filmed. It will be made available for leagues throughout the state to share with their members. You'll get further notice about exactly how you can access it. Ann already told you about the basic format, 3 minutes per each question. I think I'll probably read each question twice so that you can absorb it because, yeah, they go on a little ways. And then each person will have a minute to respond to the others. We'll mix up the order so we aren't always starting with the same person. Georgia is collecting cards, and who else is collecting? We have someone else collecting. Okay, so Georgia's going to be running all around the room collecting cards. You will too. Wonderful. Thank you. Well, yeah, we want people to be writing. Yeah, don't write them before they talk. Write questions now while they're talking as something occurs to you. And then Georgia and you will be bringing them up to our card sorters here. And we will use those to ask the questions from the audience. So, okay. Any questions anyone has about the format? All righty, then. Our first question is, since all public schools, including charters, receive taxpayer funds, for what should they all be held accountable? For example, student performance, fiscal management, employing at least 90% fully certified teachers, allowing union organizing, separation of church and state, providing for special needs, and so on. Okay? I'll read those examples through one more time. We're going to start with Mr. Hilgendorf. Since all public schools, including charters, receive taxpayer funds, for what should they all be held accountable? For instance, student performance, fiscal management, employing at least 90% fully certified teachers, allowing union organizing, separation of church and state, providing for special needs, and so on. Kurt.
Hey, good evening, everybody, and thank you for having all of us to have this very important policy discussion. I'm looking forward to the panelists as well as your questions. And on this question, we need to interrogate the idea of accountability a little bit before we answer the specifics. Other questions need to be asked. Accountable to whom? How is accountability measured or defined? Is this sort of accountability as it's been practiced currently as a punishment or threat of punishment? Or is it accountable in a sort of partnership? Are we accountable towards students, staff, parents? If it's the latter, we're on the right track. If it's the former, there are some significant problems with that kind of accountability, because that kind of accountability has really gotten public schools and public school policy into a lot of very sticky issues that we could avoid by avoiding that very heavy-handed, high-stakes accountability. If we're working to be collegial and collaborative, and not constantly issue threats, that's the way we want to go. And so those aren't the parameters of the current debate, and we have to think about those parameters. And so there are some other questions. First, student performance measured by what? Is it test scores or is it other measurements? And I ask that question because test scores are really, really bad measurements of how a school does. Test scores track most directly the students' parents' level of education and students' parents' level of income. Those are the strongest correlates to test scores. And the further thing is that test scores, when you have a very intensive focus on test scores, you have a very intensive narrowing of the curriculum. And that's a problem. If we're looking at other measurements, maybe that's what we want to hold people accountable to. Which schools produce the most electricians? Which school produces the most robust poetry program? What school has the most engineering students or the most interesting art projects? Those are the kinds of things that I think we could talk about when we talk about accountability, and that's a more community-based accountability. And when it comes to student performance, there are all kinds of incentives to fudge the numbers, shall we say. And I don't want to pick on my colleague from the Illinois Network of Charter Schools, but there was a piece of information spread earlier this week that I need to talk about. And in this communication, it said that in Chicago, charter schools represented the 11 highest performing public high schools in the district on the ACT. That is a flat, factual error. In fact, of the 11 top high schools, 8 are public high schools, 3 are charter schools, 3 are from one charter school network, and all 11 of those schools have students coming in at significantly higher levels than the average student coming in across the district. So if we're looking at ACT scores, those are very narrow measurements. And so when I think about what I would like to see charter schools be accountable for, there's two things. One is sharing innovative practices. That was the initial mission of charters, and that really hasn't happened, and I'll be happy to talk about that more. And also to be accountable for meeting the whole child's needs, which I'm happy to talk about as well.
Thank you. Now, Ms. McCullough.
Sure, thank you, and I'll echo Kurt's comment that I'm excited to be here, and thank you for inviting us. I think that I'll just dive right in and talk about what I believe charter schools and all public schools, because charter schools are public schools, need to be held accountable for. First and foremost, they need to, because accountability is critical, and I want to put that on the table as well. We think it's very important. Defined as being held accountable for what they are in existence to do, which is educate our students, which is set them up for success in their academic careers, in their future careers, in their lives. So really, we need to be looking first and foremost at student outcomes, student performance. We agree that that should not be limited to a test score. That's a very limited view. I think that's part of the story, but certainly not the whole story. We should look at how many go to college. We should look at how many stay in college, how many graduate from college, and what are they doing with their lives. So by far, the most important thing that schools need to be held accountable for is how are they doing with their kids. But that's not all. Public entities, all public entities, including charter schools, must be held accountable for strong fiscal management, for legal compliance, for running a tight ship. They're a public entity, and that's critical. The good news is charter schools are being held accountable in these ways. Charter schools, in some ways, are being held more accountable. There's an enormous burden before anyone is considered for authorization of a new charter school. Hundreds of applications are denied for every single one that is approved. So charter schools must provide a great amount of detail on all of those fronts before they're approved in the beginning. Then every year they're evaluated, every quarter they're evaluated, and there are high stakes evaluations every 5 years where their charter can be revoked if they're not delivering on those very important things that they need to be held accountable for. So accountability is critical, and charter schools, we in the charter sector are full believers in that. I think it's also important to just note, tonight we are going to talk a lot about governance. We're going to talk a lot about the charter model and how it's run, and that's important. But I don't want to take our eyes off the ball of this issue of student outcomes, and I'll be sure we try to continue to talk through that, not just student outcomes, but parent satisfaction, parent demand. Charters fundamentally exist to serve a need, and I think it's important that charter schools are held accountable for delivering on that need. So lastly, just to react to the question about the test scores, we'll have to look at our data side by side. At the Illinois Network of Charter Schools, we look at non-selective schools, and so perhaps your data includes the schools that folks can test into, and that's indeed the truth. There are schools in Chicago that score higher on the ACT that test in for their students. Charter schools, like all other non-selective CPS schools, do not test in. There's no requirement to enter. There are no fees. There's no academic requirement, and of those, charters are the top 11.
Dr. Moran.
Good evening. Yep. Charter schools are public schools, but they were envisioned as a new form of public school. And the charter school deal or bargain was that we were going to have a new public schools that were going to be highly accountable. In exchange for that, they would be given considerable autonomy. Today, we obviously have, I think, across the nation, concerns about accountability for charter schools. At the same time, we have to recognize that charter schools haven't been granted, or we've seen re-regulation, so they haven't gotten all the autonomy that was once envisioned. There's 3 types of accountability we can think about. There's regulatory accountability, where we monitor what the inputs are, what teachers' qualifications are, the textbooks, curriculum. That's traditionally how we hold public schools accountable. In recent years, we have seen a shift towards performance accountability and market accountability, and that's where charter schools fit in. Performance accountability is measuring the outputs. We don't care about the inputs. We don't care what's going on in the school. We care less about those things, but we hold them accountable based on outcomes. With performance accountability, my 2 colleagues here have mentioned some of the concerns with test results. Test results are an easy way to hold charter schools or any schools accountable, but it's not a preferable way, especially when schools have diverse populations, especially when tests are narrow the curriculum and so forth. And then we have market accountability, and there's a lot of concerns about market accountability. People think parents vote with their feet. Actually, parents, and the research has shown that parents often find out their child may be in a failing or struggling charter school, and they choose not to move because we can't change our schools like we can change consumer patterns like the box of cereal or branded cereal. We can change that every week. We go to the shopping market, but we don't do that with schools. So we have to take decisions. We have a lot of transition costs with changing. So the market accountability thing hasn't really worked, although economists, they believe in it. In terms of empirical research, we haven't really seen that works. And in fact, in some of my earlier research, we were able to show that we didn't find correlations between parents' satisfaction and the performance of the schools. So there's a lot of these connections between market accountability that don't really apply in the education sector. But charter schools were envisioned to be mission-driven, and I think this is the type of accountability I would like to see. There's basically a couple things in terms of accountability. They should be accountable to their mission, and there we need measurable objectives. We need agreement between the authorizer and the schools about what those measurable objectives are, about their unique missions. But they also have to be accountable to those legislatively mandated expectations or goals for charter schools. And then charter schools have to be accountable to taxpayers, especially in terms of transparency. And finally, they are accountable to parents, but we need an independent broker sometimes in sharing information, because parents need accurate and fair information so they can make good decisions about the schools. And right now, a lot of times they're very dependent on pamphlets and other things. So we need better evidence so that market accountability can work as well.
Dr. Hoffman.
Thank you. The ground rules make me feel very important because they feel like a presidential debate. So, so I went very literally through the list of the items that you specified, and this is my accounting. I think that being accountable for student performance, however that's defined, and I agree that. I think with everybody else on the panel that that needs to be something broader than just test scores. Student performance and fiscal management are obvious things that charter schools and public schools have to be accountable for. I think there are some gray areas. However, one of the items that that you included on the list was 90% certified teachers. This is I think the thing that I valued as a charter school director was that I knew I had to get to the same place that my colleagues in their public schools were, but how I got there was really up to me, and that's where the innovative aspects of charter schools emerged. I preferred hiring certified teachers, but there were teachers who I think we all decided had real educational value for students who were not certified. So you also mentioned union organization, and that at least in Illinois, that's built into the charter legislation, that teachers have the right to organize in charter schools, although they're precluded. Excuse me, they're precluded from organizing within the Chicago Teachers Union. The hardest item on this list for me is the special needs item, because charter schools have been appropriately criticized for being underrepresented in special needs, but I can you can't legally turn away a parent of a child with special needs, but charter schools have used various devices to discourage children with severe special needs from enrolling in their schools, and that's something that I hope we can have further discussion about in the 30-minute session. So.
Thank you. Mr. Hilgendorf, you get a minute to address anything that came up.
Sure. I'll talk about a couple of things. First, in terms of the different forms of accountability that Dr. Miron has talked about, that's not the way in which those different forms of accountability have worked in Chicago haven't been even or evenly applied. And what I mean by that is that if you're looking at it as a sort of school choice model, a lot of options for parents were closed down in 2013 and in years prior to that, when the mass wave of school closings in 2013 happened, as well as a whole series of school closings that had happened prior to that year. And so that really places sort of a market imbalance, if you will, in that particular situation. And we can talk more about that. The other thing that I want to talk about is the idea of public schools versus non-public schools, because what's often happened, and the example of Chicago Math and Science Academy is instructive, is that some charters want to be private when it benefits them, and public when it benefits them. And if it's going to be one way or another, it has to be one way or another in order to be fair for everyone.
Ms. McCullough.
Thanks. A couple things to respond to. One, on this issue of the special education concern, I think it's important to just note that the actual numbers in the district in Chicago, where we have the most charter schools in the state, are pretty parallel for charter schools and traditionally run district schools. There is a disparity in terms of the number of if you break down the special needs students in different ways, there are some disparities, and part of that is because not all charter schools are set up to serve kids with the most extreme disabilities. But the same thing is true for many traditionally run public schools. And so within CPS, there are certain schools that are specifically designed for certain kids with certain disabilities. That's no different in charters versus in traditional district schools. So it's an important issue to look at, but I just wanted to clarify that. And then finally, on this issue, I don't have time to address the issue of choice and parents voting with their feet, but we'll come back to that.
Dr. Miron.
So the charter school idea is a great idea, and I want to go back to that, but it's frustrating that after 2 decades we're still struggling with the question of accountability, because that was what was unique about them. But charter schools predate the performance or standards-based movement and No Child Left Behind and all the testing. And at that time, traditional public schools were not very accountable or easy. It wasn't easy for policymakers to know how they were performing. So charter schools, the idea that we had in the 90s, that they were going to be mission-driven, and that meant that they had to have annual reports where they would report on their unique mission-related objectives. And it was a great idea. At my university, we went out and we did a lot of training for charter schools in Hawaii and Connecticut, Michigan, Pennsylvania, training them to develop their own ability to collect and report data so that they could be proactive and demonstrate accountability. Over time, however, charter schools haven't been proactive, and in turn they've been swept into the accountability systems that are in place for all traditional public schools.
Dr. Howell.
I also wanted to comment on the original vision of charter schools. I think some of you in the audience are already familiar with this, but the original idea of charter schools actually grew from within the teachers union. Albert Shanker, who was president of the American Federation of Teachers, designed this idea, and the charter schools were intended to be beacons of innovation, and I think some of them were initially. I think what we have to deal with in the charter school movement is the extent to which we've moved away from that original vision.
Thank you. Can everybody hear okay? Is there any? Okay, great. The second question, we're going to start with Ms. McAuliffe. Should the public be able to vote in a referendum to overrule a charter authorization approved by an unelected body? Unelected bodies include the Chicago Board of Education, the State Charter School Commission, the Illinois State Board of Education. Why or why not? Okay. Should the public be able to vote in a referendum to overrule a charter authorization approved by an unelected body? Unelected bodies include Chicago Board of Ed, State Charter School Commission, Illinois State Board of Ed. Why or why not? Ms. McAuliffe.
Thanks. So first, I think it's important, again, to come back to what the central purpose of charter schools are, which is to empower parents to make a choice that they feel is best for them, for their children. And they may feel that they don't have a traditionally run district school in their neighborhood, in their district, that meets their needs. And so charter schools exist to provide another option. And parents like that. So in Chicago, 60,000 of them have taken CPS up on the offer to send their child to a charter school. There are thousands more who are on wait lists. 2/3 of charter parents say they're highly satisfied with their school versus 1/3 of traditionally run district schools in CPS. So the numbers go on and on. Parents like choice. Parents are taking advantage of it and more want to. So to the specific question of whether there should be a referendum that would overrule the authorization of a charter school, I think we have to ask who's the public that's being questioned about in the referendum. So if you have parents in one neighborhood that are interested in a charter option, is the public another citizen in the city who may have a student themselves, who may not be a parent, who may have a student they're sending to private school, who may, have the means to buy $1 million home and send their student to a school that they find to be good enough within CPS, or the right fit for them? Do they have veto power over the parent that doesn't have that option? I find that to be problematic. So I think no, I don't think that there should be a referendum option for overruling a charter school authorization. Also, I think it's important to note that many decisions are made in the public sphere by groups that are not directly elected, that are rather appointed by elected officials. This is true throughout state government, throughout city government, and I think we need to question why this is specifically being asked about charter schools versus the many other myriad things that are decided by such entities.
Dr. Brown.
A public vote, well, to the best of my knowledge, this doesn't exist anywhere in the country, that we don't have referendums on things like a charter school application. We do have some states that have votes with parents. Parents can vote to leave along with teachers. They can vote so that their traditional public school can opt out to become a charter school. We have that in a few states, but we don't have any case that I'm aware of, any state that you can actually do this. It sounds like a good idea, but I'm not sure that it's practical. It may be quite costly to do this. Initially, the authorizers of charter schools have been closer to publicly elected bodies, either local school boards, state school boards, or, but in more recent years, in the last decade, charter school establishment and the advocates for charter schools have been pushing very strongly, very concerted effort to get multiple authorizers, and that would get those states a better rating as a pro-charter or positive for charter schools. But what has happened with these these appointed boards, there's two types of boards. Some of the boards are there to grant charters that other authorizers don't consider, and a second type of board are those that take appeals. So if a local school district turns down an application, then they can go to the state appointed board. The state appointed boards have tended to be very pro-charter school and very permissive, whereas those original authorizers that are closer to the elected officials or local community tend to be more restrictive and cautious. So my sense is that it's a good idea for a public referendum, but I'm not sure that it's at all practical, and I'm not sure it's feasible.
Dr. Huffman.
Well, what's amusing about this question is that the only time that this issue has come up is when one non-elected entity, the State Charter School Commission, overruled the decision of another non-elected body, which is the CPS board, which happened, was it last year or 2 years ago? Last year. I think that this question also masks a larger issue that's gotten considerable attention in the last year or so, which has to do with people who are advocating for the return of an elected school board in Chicago.
And for clarification, we never had an elected school board in Chicago.
Excuse me?
We never had an elected school board in Chicago.
You say it's not a return.
Okay.
There's some other facts that
Can we wait till the audience has a chance to?
Okay, I appreciate that. But there has been a movement among community activists for an elected school board. I'll modify my language. I think the idea of a referendum is not a practical solution, because these are local, sort of community level issues, and as far as I know, there's no mechanism for that kind of localized referendum. So I think the question is somewhat moot. I will say that CPS has, although all these processes are subject to abuse, CPS does have a very elaborate and rather respectable vetting process. You really have to jump through some challenging hoops in order to get a charter school approved in Chicago, which is not the case in a large areas of the country. And I think I'll stop there.
Mr. Hilgenberg.
My answer to this question is absolutely. There should be an option for a referendum to overrule either the State Charter School Commission, or I'd love to see one in the Chicago Board of Ed, but that's probably not going to happen anytime soon. There's a long history of local control in Illinois, and that schools are the public's most democratic and direct involvement with government, and it should maintain that way. That local control is valued, and it doesn't exist in Chicago. And I'm going to try to tell 2 one-minute history lessons. The first is that when charters were conceived, as people have mentioned, they were never designed to compete with traditional public schools. But what's happened in Chicago, especially since 2003, when charter expansion really ramped up, this came about as a result of a very concerted effort by the Civic Committee of the Commercial Club of Chicago to expand charter schools across the city and close traditional public schools. And it was done by, on the back of 2 reports. The 2003 Left Behind report that said that public schools are failing, and that the only way to fix them is to open up market competition against charter schools. The same thing happened in 2009, and the report said we need more charter schools and more charter schools, even though at this point it had been 5 years and that there hadn't been sufficient movement. So we're asking for more policy prescription that didn't change anything in the first place. And so what happened is that this was an attempt to really, by people who had a vested economic interest in the expansion of charter schools, to create more charter schools. It wasn't something that parents across the city were clamoring for. This was something that had been imposed. Now, as far as the State Charter School Commission is concerned, this is not, again, something that people were clamoring for on the ground. This is an initiative of the American Legislative Exchange Committee, or ALEC. This is also the same organization that pushed stand your ground laws at the heart of the Trayvon Martin shooting, as well as gun liberalization laws across the country, anti-environmental laws, etc. And that the schools that have been approved by the Charter School Commission are currently under federal investigation in Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois for significant federal improprieties in terms of how federal money has been used. So when we talk about having a situation in overruling this is something that needs to be addressed. And the final thing I'll say is that the reason why this commission was set up was because local communities that had elected school boards were not approving charter school applications at the rate at which charter school proponents and operators wanted them to approve them. So this became another way to approve charter schools, and that it's part of a bigger political move to expand charter schools and expand the political base of those who run them.
Thank you very much. Now the 1-minute responses, starting with Ms. McAuliffe.
Sure. So to reflect back on the history lesson that's been painted here of charter schools being a top-down sort of forced initiative, I think we can do another history lesson, which is let's take a look at who started charter schools and why, and who has done that. It is not something that has been plotted in towers somewhere by pernicious actors. Rather, it's by educators, community members, people who have passionate beliefs in what's best for students, based in many cases—
Let's be polite, please.
Based in many cases on their own experience as teachers or other community activists. So we'll take we can take many examples, but you know, the expansion of charter schools has largely been driven by passionate people who are educators and passionate parents who are looking out for what's best for their kids.
Okay, I do want to remind you that this is a league-sponsored event, and respect for the speakers is a high priority. Dr. Moran.
I like what Stacy said about who started charter schools and what charter schools were about, but you're talking about the charter school idea. You're talking about what we believed in the 1990s. Somebody stole our charter school reform. We're not pursuing that original vision. And but I agree with you. The charter school idea is a beautiful idea. It's great. We're far from that today. And I also agree with Kurt, what he talked about, these appointed boards and so forth. These were largely implemented in states where they had an approach towards quality versus quantity. They thought that we could improve traditional public schools by example, by innovations and so forth. Illinois also went through that. They didn't have enough charter schools, they weren't, and it's shifted. But there's many people that still believe that charter schools can improve traditional public schools, but it's through competition now. And I think that's what we've shifted towards now in the state.
I'm sorry, Dr. Hoffman.
I also wanted to make the same historical point. What you were describing, Stacy, was true of the early charter school movement. I think you would be hard-pressed to find very many examples of teacher-led and teacher-driven new charter schools in recent years. They have mostly been the product of charter management organizations.
And Mr. Hilgendorf.
Dr. Miron and Dr. Huffman and those fancy PhDs have stolen all my thunder, but I'll try to, I want to speak a little bit about two quick points. One is the evidence, if it were actually being driven by parents and teachers, that there would be a lot of single-site charter schools rather than large chains, and that's simply not the case. The single-site charter schools are the most likely ones to die off, and those were the places where the true innovations that were sort of imagined initially were happening, and that's not the case. And the second point is, as we talk more about this choice issue, is that it's choice but a very limited extent. If you don't have a car, you can't make the same kind of choices if you do. If you don't have access to being able to do all of the applications, and it's a very voluminous process, you don't have access to that level of choice. And so it seems to me that a better solution would be to improve the schools we have rather than to try to add a lot more.
Thank you very much. The third question, we'll start with Dr. Moran. Should charter schools, including those managed by for-profit companies, be transparent about conflicts of interest of governing board members, sources of revenues, salaries and benefits of executives and board members, as well as teachers and administrators, and ownership of properties and buildings? So, once again, should charter schools, including those managed by for-profit companies, be transparent about conflicts of interest of governing board members, sources of revenue, salaries and benefits of executives, board members, as well as teachers and administrators, ownership of property and buildings? Dr. Moran.
It's striking that this is even an issue. Conflicts of interest, yes. Sources of revenue, yes, they should be transparent on that. Salaries and benefits, yes, they're traditional, they're public schools too. Ownership of property and buildings, we should know about those things. We're taxpayers, yes, on all of these. So it's just striking that we're even debating this because they're public schools, of course. But let's look at what has happened to our charter school idea. At the National Education Policy Center, where I'm a fellow, we've been doing 14 annual reports on education management organizations, and we've been tracking the growth of these organizations. We'll have our next report, the 15th edition, out in November. Our estimate is that by next year, more than half of the nation's charter school students will be enrolled in privately owned and operated charter schools. If we look at the growth of the charter school movement today, it's largely fueled by these both nonprofit and for-profit companies that are scaling up, and they are not necessarily innovative. And the way that these schools usually start is the management companies, they do their market analysis, they decide where to locate schools, they write the applications, they submit the applications. After that, they go in search of a governing board, a group of parents that can sign off on those things, and the governing board then hires the management company. And when we look at the contracts from these companies, we see that increasingly they're shifting towards contracts that say that all of the public revenues that come into the charter school will go to the management company. That's a shared account, or it's moved over to account for the management company. The management company guarantees a 2 or 3% year-end balance. That's the type of contracts we're seeing today. So the board doesn't have a need to know about budget issues and so forth. We have instances in Ohio with one management company, White Hat Management, where the charter school boards are suing in court the management company because they want to get insight into finance. The schools are struggling and the boards are getting heat from the media, but they don't know where the money's going. So this is one great example. Back in 2002, just to do a little plug for a book, I wrote a book with a colleague. It's called What's Public About Charter Schools? And we took up these issues because in Michigan, we were at that time, 50% of our schools were run by for-profit companies. Today we have 79% of our schools are run by for-profit companies and 10% are run by nonprofit EMOs, and only 11% are independent, or that original idea about charter schools being locally run. So back in 2002, we wrote this book, and we were talking about trying to raise a flag and hoping other states could learn from what was happening in Michigan, because that reform was changed, and the ideas of the reform had been changed very much by the private involvement. These were envisioned as public schools, not privately operated schools. So
I think I can save a lot of my 3 minutes here because I agree with you that there really isn't any issue about transparency here. These are public schools, regardless of how they're managed and by whom they're managed. They're operating with public funds, and all of this information should be available to the public. You worded your question very carefully, and I want to underscore it because she asked whether this should be true of schools that are managed by for-profit organizations. Just as a point of information, the charter school law is that the charters have to be granted to nonprofit entities. What's happened, however, is that those a lot of those entities have subcontracted with for-profit organizations to actually operate the schools. The largest charter management organization in Chicago, Chicago International, the largest network of charter schools, Chicago International Charter Schools, has subcontracted to a number of different for-profit organizations for the operation of their schools. I just wanted to make sure that people understood that.
Thank you for the clarification. Mr. Hilgenberg.
I would like to echo the comments of Dr. Miron and Dr. Huffman, who have already said yes to this question of transparency, and that we view it as only a first step. There also needs to be regulations in place because that initial vision for charter schools has morphed to something different. Then the regulations need to match the existing realities. And so one of the things where this is really complicated is the complexity in the organizations that the two speakers have mentioned to this point, is that there are very complex organizational arrangements for how nonprofit charter board may subcontract to a for-profit company who may also contract with other companies for different parts of the management structure, which makes it very, very difficult to understand just how the money is being used, what kind of services are being provided, and whether or not there might be more effective structures to be used for that form of education. And there's a couple of situations just with the UNO scandal in Chicago that suggests that there needs to be a lot more openness on charter schools and charter financing, and the developing or the ongoing concept issue in the federal investigation behind concept schools that's not just in Illinois but across the country suggests that we have a long ways to go on this transparency question, because the complexity makes it possible to use schools in ways in which they were never intended to be used, and that by dialing back on the complexity, we can really get back to the original mission of educating kids.
Ms. McAuliffe.
And so I will make it a unanimous answer on this question, which is we're all in total agreement. There should be full transparency on all of these items. And we in the charter sector have always said this, so we're happy to support it as well. A couple things to add on that. Just to reiterate the point about all charter schools in Illinois being held by, or charters in Illinois being held by nonprofit entities, and then they can contract out to a management company if they like. In Illinois, it's actually extremely rare. I think there are less than 5 out of the 145 that are run by for-profit management companies. Which is very different than a state like Michigan, obviously, based on the data that he's just shared and that I'm familiar with. Michigan, Arizona, Texas, there are a number of other states in the country that early on in since we're doing history lessons, early on in the charter movement really were sort of the Wild West of the charter movement, and the management companies did what was described and really sort of made an effort to set up shop as quickly as possible with as many schools as possible. I'm happy to say that didn't happen in Illinois because quality really took a dive in those places. In Illinois, authorizing has always been higher quality than that. And as a result, we don't have as many of those groups like White Hat that I think have had both financial and student performance challenges. So that's good news. On the issue of results that I want to come back to. I do think we have to always look at that. So governance is critical. There are issues that can be problematic with how a management company and its charter holders' relationship are structured. We should clean those up. It's essential. These are public entities and they should be held accountable. But we always have to also look at results. And so just because someone is for profit doesn't mean they're bad. We have to look at how they're doing as well. Finally, on the point about UNO and concept, I think it's important that we take a hard look at what's going on. If there is a problem that emerges, let's take a scalpel to that problem. Let's not take a sledgehammer and indict the entire charter model for something that happens in one school or one network. Authorizers are charged with looking hard at financial practices, at relationships between boards and management companies. In quarterly reports that CPS receives, they have great detail on this. So let's make sure our authorizing is tight and our authorizing is powerful, because we do need to be focused, as he said, on what we're charged with, which is educating students.
Thank you. Dr. Moran.
Yep. Just we're on agreement, so I'll just elaborate a little bit more. But in practice, if we want to ensure transparency, this is something that has to happen with the authorizers. The authorizers, before granting a charter, they have to make sure that these things are understood and by the governing board. And also, what we see in many states, that the authorizer should approve any management agreements. Sometimes the board, especially when the board is, what we see is that when a management company will start a school, they'll find a list of people, they'll put them forward to the authorizer, then the authorizer will rubber stamp them, you are the public nonprofit entity, and then they contract to the for-profit or nonprofit company. Well, that's a really weak thing. We need those roles to change. We need the boards to be stronger, and that's really important then for the authorizer to say, well, you know, if you're going to hire this management company, we want to approve the contract, and in that contract, it has to have stipulations about transparency.
Thank you. Dr. Huffman?
I'm going to save my 1 minute for the question and answer period, which is always the most interesting part of the evening anyway. So.
Thank you. Mr. Hooper?
I'll second that.
Yeah.
Okay. Ms. McAuliffe?
I'm on board with that.
Okay, thank you very much. So the last question, we will start with Dr. Hoffman. How can charter schools and traditional public schools coexist without fighting over the extremely limited education funding provided by Illinois? I'm not sure I need to repeat that one. Okay, we'll start with Dr. Hoffman.
Okay, I think here we're going to return to some of the themes that have cropped up in the response to the earlier questions, and going back to the original vision of charters as places that could be of benefit to other public schools who might adopt their innovations. That charter schools were never intended to supplant public schools, which is what's happened in places like New Orleans, and which I think some political figures would like to see happen here. I think it's unfortunate that that neighborhood schools and charter schools are at loggerheads because. And the efforts that have been made to drive wedges between them, because there are large issues that the charter school world and the rest of the public school world need to collaborate on. There are bigger issues that are sometimes masked by this charter school debate. The issues about school funding in general. I think that's what we really should be talking about, and that's where there's common ground between charter schools and neighborhood schools. There are a lot deeper questions that we have to unite around. Teacher quality, all the assessment issues that have been discussed here, and there are examples around the country of school districts where there is this kind of collaboration between charter schools and neighborhood schools. This is not a pipe dream, and unfortunately, the situation in Chicago is so polarized that it's been very difficult to find common ground there.
May I ask everybody to please turn off your cell phones? Thank you.
I just want to say
Go
one more
ahead,
thing.
Yes, sorry.
This may seem like a far-fetched idea, but I think one of the things that that could reduce this conflict is creating the equivalent of an environmental impact statement. If a charter school is going to exist, what impact is it going to have on the surrounding neighborhood schools? We had an example in Chicago this year of a Noble Street campus, opening adjacent to a fairly successful, well-functioning high school. Well, that's the kind of thing that shouldn't be necessary, shouldn't be happening, and this is an area where where there shouldn't be a battle for a conflict around funding issues. Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Hildendorf.
I would start with two big picture issues, and that the first is to really ensure that there's actual local control over school decisions to be made. So if a local school district decides that it wants to, and the people and the families and parents, students are involved in that process, decide that this is something they want to go forward with, they have an option to do so, but not that something necessarily has to be imposed on communities. And the second thing, building off of what Dr. Hoffman said, is the solution to avoiding fighting over funds is to sufficiently fund schools. And we have such a huge disparity in school funding across the state that there's no, absent a huge infusion of money at the state level that can then be distributed to districts more equitably, there's no way to fix that system given the system of local property taxes and the dependence on which local property taxes go to fund schools in Illinois. And I'd be happy to have a long conversation with all of you about that some other time. But there's a few other specific things I think that we could do to really drive as much money towards the classroom as possible and to try to make the very limited resources, especially in those communities where charter schools are most likely to be located, to do that. The first is to really put some limits on what the money can be spent on. One thing that's come out of competition between traditional public schools and charter schools has been a huge increase in the amount of marketing fees and marketing expenses that schools have had to incur, which seems completely crazy to me that schools are advertising themselves. So there are ways in which we could do that. There could be limits on compensation. There could be limits or requirements of direct service minimums. X% has to be spent on instruction, et cetera. Those are ways that we could drive money to classrooms. The second thing is, while there is a very small number of for-profit educational management organizations in Illinois, we could put a cap and say no additional ones in the future. That would be a way to really limit money that's directly taken out of classrooms that could be used for education. And the third one would be to put a halt to expansion of charter schools, because what's happened in Chicago, given the fact that you have a very flat or declining student population, that adding additional schools only creates the exact same situation that we had in 2013 where 50 traditional public schools were closed. And at the rate at which charter schools are being proposed to be expanded at 12 a year, in 5 years we're at the exact same place. So if you're going to create, you can't avoid resource conflicts if you're continuing to add additional buildings that cause schools to fight over enrollment and to have to go out and recruit students. This is something that public schools shouldn't have to do, and that we could talk about other ideas, but I think that's enough for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. McCough.
Great. So first, total agreement that the first thing we can do is work together to try to improve the funding environment, whether that's growing the pie somehow, or whether that's distributing the pie more equitably. And the charter sector is very involved in a coalition of groups that expands beyond the charter sector in trying to make that happen. But again, barring that or assuming that hasn't happened, how do we use the limited dollars that we have effectively? One is that we need to spend the money we have wisely. So money needs to follow students. If a parent decides that their student is going to attend one school versus another, the same public school dollars need to follow that child. Otherwise, it's completely inequitable and unfair. Why should one student get access to more public dollars than another? So schools, dollars follow kids. That's one. Two is once those dollars land at a school, what do we do with them? And I think we're essentially on the opposite side of a coin on this. While he's suggesting that there be strong limits to what a principal can do with those dollars, we would suggest that the principal should be empowered to spend those dollars in the best way that will meet their students' needs, taking input from the people who are closest to the ground, the teachers and the principal, to make those decisions, as opposed to having that directed from above, from a central office. That's something that charter principals have enjoyed since the beginning of the charter sector, and it's led to innovation and results. Let's just think about a couple of examples. North Lawndale College Prep is a school in North Lawndale, and it's been around since early years of the charter sector. They noticed that while they were having great success with graduation and great success with sending their students on to college from a neighborhood that had not seen a lot of students going to college, they didn't have success with their graduates staying in college. So they worked their budget and they allocated more dollars toward they allocated more dollars toward college counselors to ensure that there was the right fit between a student and the school that they were attending. They allocated dollars toward people whose job was to actually track and support alumni, because they saw it as part of their mission to ensure that those students had success, did not just graduate and sort of check the box. And so that's an example of where budget autonomy and principal empowerment can actually lead directly to student outcomes. And so, we've advocated in the charter sector for all public school principals to have that kind of power and that kind of decision-making authority. And I think that's a key way that we can use our money most wisely.
Dr. Moran.
In urban areas, our schools that are serving children in poverty are struggling. Both charter schools, if we look at the aggregate, charter schools and traditional public schools are struggling in serving those populations still. We have excellent charter schools and traditional public schools. We have exceptional ones that stand out even though they're serving high needs populations. And also we have less well-performing schools. But when we look at this competition, many people think in these areas that the traditional public schools, the economic theory and advocates talk about this. Some advocates, but they talk about charter schools or public schools, traditional public schools have to hurt. One person at the American Enterprise Institute said, we have to cut to the bone, and then finally those traditional public schools will wake up and start to improve and serve their kids better. And I listened to that, these economic theories and so forth about competition, and I think about the kids that might be hurt by this. But I've also seen one very large study in metropolitan Detroit that tracked students' movements in traditional public schools and charter schools alike. And what they found is that there was a slight and modest impact from competition. But once 6 to 7%, between 6 and 7% of the students left the traditional public school, in terms of, and that's what they call market saturation. Once there was more competition, those traditional public schools went into a negative spiral. So they couldn't respond. They were losing a lot of resources. They had fixed assets, and instead of responding, they were hurting more and more, but they weren't getting better. They were hurting more and they were getting worse. They couldn't respond because they were losing the most resource-rich parents. They were losing a lot of money with the money following the students. So I'm not sure if I buy all that. We have to be very careful about this competition, how it's going to serve these communities, because what we're doing today is we're taking limited resources now and stretching it across two struggling systems. And I think we have to take decisions carefully about charter schools so that we can get schools that maybe that are not going to have a negative impact. In terms of some specific ideas, I think charter schools should be required to recruit from all segments of the district. They can't give preferences or pick or select kids, but they should be recruiting from all segments. I think we should be when we authorize, we should be very selective in who gets charters and thinking about what impact they may have. I think we have to adjust funding formulas. There's a lot of tension between district schools and charter schools because of funding formulas. I think and there's the gaming of the systems, which is competition. More funding has to be allocated for secondary school students because they cost more to educate. More funding for schools that offer extracurricular activities. More funding for schools with vocational technical lines. And I think we also have to look at, I think if we're going to address this concern about the coexisting, I think we have to go back to the original idea of charter schools, because there we saw a vision of schools that could collaborate with traditional public schools.
Thank you, Dr. Hoffman.
So, two quick comments. One about money following the child. I mean, interestingly, this is one of the areas where charter schools have actually had an impact on traditional schools, because basically the funding arrangement for traditional Chicago public schools now is on a per pupil basis, just the way charter schools are. And this is one of those situations where you have to watch out what you wish for, because that's brought all kinds of unintended consequences, like the disincentive to hire more experienced teachers because they cost more, and you're working with a discrete amount of money as opposed to a discrete number of teaching slots, which was the way money was allocated in the past. So, the issue of recruiting from all segments of that's been okay. I'll save that for the larger conversation. So.
Mr. Obendorf.
I'll talk briefly about the issue of student-based budgeting as practice in the Chicago public schools, and this idea that this was a way to empower principals. And there's two flaws with this. First is that student-based budgeting was implemented in a way that actually masked major cuts to schools across the city of Chicago. And two is that it actually didn't empower principals because they didn't have enough money to do what they needed to do. So there have been libraries across the city that are in their high schools, like 5 and 9 high schools, don't have libraries because they've had to force the librarian into a teaching position and didn't have anybody to staff the library. And that the old model of having empowerment and community decision making, the LSC had power over the budget. The local school council had power over the budget to make that decision. When it shifted to the principal, and on top of big cuts to education, there's very little empowerment. Last point, there's a tangible difference between putting up a billboard and having a college counselor. And so when we talk about having schools allocate their money, certain categories should be out and should be open if it's educationally useful.
Ms. McCough.
Sure. So on student-based budgeting and the issue of schools losing libraries, I mean, unfortunately, that's not a problem with student-based budgeting. That's a problem with how many dollars there are. And it is unfortunate that student-based budgeting hit in a year where there were massive cuts. I totally agree. It's very unfortunate because it's muddling two different issues. One is how much money there is, which is a problem, and two is how the money is spent. And so if this had happened in a year when if this had happened 6 years ago when there was much more money in the system and we weren't in such a feeling of zero-sum game, I think we would be talking about it a little differently, and it's important to have that historical perspective. But ultimately, I just want to touch again on what someone said. We are all in this together, right? And so if we think about how can we coexist, we need to be looking at what works for kids. And so we can celebrate together when there are successes like CPS's graduation rate announcement that they just made. That's great. The charter sector contributed to that, and the traditional district schools contributed to that. And we'll come back to talking about that a little bit more.
Thank you. Finally, Dr. Morrow.
Some of the outcomes of charter schools, although we've moved away from the original idea, when we look at charter schools broadly today, the two things they are accomplishing is they are promoting privatization of our public school systems, and they are promoting an acceleration of segregation by race, by class, by ability, by English language status, and by also special education status. We see schools that are segregated of white or segregated of black. We see schools that there's about 50 or 60 charter schools in the country that really focus on children with moderate and severe disabilities. Most have smaller amounts, very small amounts, and they tend to be children with mild disabilities. They're accelerating this, and I think we have to look at this. And I guess one of the big concerns I have today are the college prep charter schools that are growing rapidly because they have a devastating effect on traditional public schools. The way they market themselves, they have selective entry processes, they have very rigorous standards, and that's good, but it also results in selective exit processes where many children who can't handle the rigor or don't have supportive parents are exiting and putting a greater burden on traditional public schools.
Thank you. What I'd like to do is call about a 3 to 5 minute break, give you a chance to stretch, but also to write down whatever questions you haven't had a chance to turn in yet. Let me remind you how the questions are handled, that we will not be taking questions called out from the audience. They must be written on a card, and then we'll be asking them partly so that we don't have duplication and so that we can ensure a modicum of respect. So, okay, we will reconvene at 10 after, and thank you. We have had a number of good questions. I think some of the questions that we got have already been answered. So, we'll start with, we'll see how far we can get. We are planning on wrapping up about 8:45, but we understand that the library starts giving a whole bunch of announcements. So as soon as they start giving announcements, we may have to start winding down. Okay, here's the first one. For the most part, the focus has been on Chicago public schools. Which makes a certain amount of sense because that's certainly where most of them are located. What are your views on charters in suburban Chicago and the rest of Illinois? Open for any, who would like to take that one?
I mean, I'll say a few words, which is that there aren't very many of them. So right now there are 15 or 14 charter schools outside Chicago out of like 145 in the state. So it's very small. And that includes downstate, Rockford, all over. You know, I think that the need for options and the need for different models of schools is not limited to the city of Chicago. So there may be places that there's great interest in charter schools. You know, we at Inks here because we work with groups that are looking to go through the process of applying for charter schools. So we hear about a lot of community groups, a lot of parents, a lot of educators from around the state that are inquiring about the process to open a school. And we know that there are a lot of underperforming schools that exist in various places and communities that are interested in having more options. So I think there is a place for more charter schools. We're certainly not in the business of thinking about more is better. That's not at all the orientation of the charter sector in Illinois, but I do think there are opportunities that could be met.
I'll take a quick stab. There are schools in the rest of the state, and the charter school, Springfield Ball Charter, is the example of sort of how the initial vision was met most closely in schools outside of Chicago, to my knowledge, where the local community was behind it, that included the teachers and the teachers union local in Springfield that were supportive of that building. That's much different than the model in Chicago. And I know that there's also been a push to try to have charters in a lot of other places, including an 18-campus virtual charter high school that would have been operated by the for-profit K-12 Inc. Company that's part of one of the biggest virtual charter school operators in this country. Every single school district rejected that charter application, and it created a huge issue in the western suburbs and sort of west of here, out Batavia, Aurora, and north, sort of along the Fox River. And that spoke to a lot of people outside of the city who said, we actually have a different model for how we want to do education in our community. And that model was, we want to make sure that the existing public school infrastructure is as good as it can possibly be, and that having a separate charter school that would receive the exact same amount of student funding, even though it had no physical facilities to maintain, would be a very significant drain on the resources of that local school, and that they could do a much better job working with the students in their communities by maintaining the existing infrastructure. And so this idea of choice in a lot of places is, how can we adapt the schools that we already have to better serve the students who are here, rather than creating additional sort of duplicates of buildings and programs that create a lot of additional problems.
Here's where the limited funding really becomes a major issue, because when you're dealing with these smaller entities, a small suburban or rural community, withdrawing a chunk of money, to support a charter school really has a significant impact on, on the existing school. So it's in many ways much more complicated and difficult to, to pull off than it is in a big city like Chicago.
Okay, the next one we tried to clarify, so I hope we did it justice. If not, please write another one and we'll ask that one. Comment on the racial and ethnic disparity between the student body and staff in charters in contrast to traditional public schools.
So we've done a little research into this question, and statewide, the average, in terms of the teacher demographics, in schools across the state, there's about 15% teachers of color and about 85% white teachers in Illinois. In Chicago, it's about, and this gets into the sort of disparity, what we call the diversity gap in terms of students versus staff. In traditional public schools in Chicago, teachers of color are about 42%. And for the most recent data that we looked at, for a student body, that's 85%. Latino, African American, and other races. In charter schools, the difference or the gap is 30% teachers of color across the sector, 95% students of color, and there are some charter school networks that had 95% students of color and 15 or 14 or 10% teachers of color. And so you have a huge disparity between the teachers in the building don't look very much like the students in the building. And that's not to say that teachers of different ethnicities, races, and backgrounds can't teach other students, but that there has to be a very effective mix to be able to be really effective in those environments. And I think that that's a real issue that's not just in Chicago, but in charter schools across the country.
So I will say that I think there's an issue with this. This is an important issue across charter and traditional public schools based on the numbers that he was quoting. And I think I would also like to comment on the issue that was raised previously about charters accelerating racial disparity, which is problematic to understand because in CPS schools, traditional or charter, we have very little diversity. I think that's unfortunate, but that's not a charter issue. And so I would be interested in talking further about that, but I think that it's important to know that that existed well before charters emerged.
Perhaps we need to talk more in terms of economic disparity than
Right.
racial disparity. So, should charters be required to provide transportation for students who cannot afford to get there otherwise?
I'll take that one. Yeah.
Yep.
Yes, they should. When we look internationally at school choice reforms and how they should be structured, there's a number of things that need to be in place to have good school choice systems. We need fair and equal information that can be provided usually by an independent broker. They need transportation because if we really want the schools to be open to everybody, we need transportation. Right now, in a number of states, transportation is optional. Some states we're seeing that transportation is required and that the charter school has to have the same transportation policy as the district. In other states we're seeing that the district pays for all the transportation for charters and district schools alike. But transportation should be provided in states like Michigan where all schools get money. Part of the per pupil funding is for transportation. They have an option of providing it or not. Well, many schools don't provide transportation, and that helps them in two ways. One, it excludes a lot of single parent families or low income families. And two, they just save money because they're not spending it on transportation. But yes, I believe they should be required to provide transportation to ensure equal access to all students.
How many charters in Illinois have been revoked? In your opinion, should more have been revoked?
I actually don't know the number of charters that have been revoked. I know that there's a small number that have ceased operations, but I don't know that number either. It's a small number, less than 10.
I agree. It's a small number, and I think that it's important to take a hard look at that because that is part of the model. That if charter schools are not succeeding, we've always been the first to say, if charter schools are not succeeding in fulfilling their mission and delivering results for students, or otherwise failing the charter that they have signed on to, they are up for consideration to be closed. And so that's on the table, and it should be considered.
There have been a small number of charter schools that were closed for management reasons, not for student performance reasons. There are also several schools that have been placed essentially on probation. When they've come up for renewal, the usual renewal is 5 years. They've been granted 2-year renewals instead of 5. With the requirement that they improve their performance. But the number of closings has been very small.
And in some cases, that the probationary methods or approach has really driven dramatic change at a school. And it has led to a switch in the model, it has led to a switch in leadership, it has led to other things that the board has decided to do to respond. And in many cases, this is not news to the school. The school also believes they're struggling and needs to address a set of things. And so there are a lot of schools that have dramatically improved on their performance after that process.
In terms of closing down schools that are struggling, we actually have very strong opposition to that, because that's a hammer that is something that once you do it, you can't undo it. And so the issue of closing schools for performance is a challenge, because not only you do a few things, and the first place I taught was at Englewood High School, and that school had been phased out, and I started, and the kids felt defeated because they had failed, and they were the reason that the school had closed, even though it had been a 3-decade policy outcome at that point. And so that's not the message we need to be sending to young people who are dealing with a whole variety of other challenges in their lives. The other thing is that if you close a school and open up a new school, that new school takes a significant amount of time to get up and running. It takes time to open up a school, to get the staff up to speed and establish a culture in terms of developing those very important collaborative relationships. And so the idea that somehow we can close schools and close our way to success is a very, very problematic idea.
To add a personal note, I was on the board of a charter school that closed last year of its own volition, and it was, I would say, reflective of some of the really poor management policies of CPS, because there are parts of the city that have been saturated with charter schools, so that the schools have actually wound up cannibalizing each other for students. This is not just about competition between traditional schools and charter schools. It's competition among charter schools. So there's been very, very poor long-range planning around charter schools. And so when I see that Mr. Rauner is talking about raising the cap on the number of charter schools in the city to 80, the question of where those are going to be and what the environmental impact of opening additional schools is going to be on the rest of the school system is that's problematic.
Teachers in non-charter public schools have legally protected ways to participate in decisions in the workplace, for instance, collective bargaining. Are there legally protective mechanisms in charter schools that the teachers have to participate in decision-making in the workplace?
Charter schools, if we go back to the original idea, one of the ideas that we saw embedded in legislation, or one of the expectations with charter schools, were going to provide new opportunities for teachers too, not only student choice, but also for teachers. Teachers would be able to choose a school that fit their interest. And we had, in the 90s, we had a number of teacher-run charter schools in many of the states that I worked in. And so that was pretty exciting. When we look today, though, that's not the case. And even when we see charter schools where in states where they can have collective bargaining, they're still at-will employees that they may be fired from their charter school, but they can go back into the district. But the teachers, there's very, very high attrition in charter schools. We did an attrition study across 6 states. We found in first-year teachers in charter schools 40% attrition rates. On average, for all charter schools, not only first-year charter schools, but between 25 and 30% of the teachers are changing annually. So this suggests, that that it's not ideal for teachers, that teachers aren't finding new opportunities there, and many of them are using it as a stepping stone. So when we looked at the reasons for that attrition, we found that teachers were unhappy with the mission of the school, the way it was being implemented, and also unhappy with working conditions. Those are the two factors that led to them then leaving.
Well, I think it's challenging to look at national studies, right? Because the country, the environment for charter schools in one state versus another is so dramatically different. Michigan versus in Illinois is like night and day. So it's challenging to look at national numbers, number one.
Illinois was one of the 6 states that we looked at.
Okay, well, number two, attrition in all traditional CPS schools and charter schools, all CPS schools, traditional and charter, is very high. So I think it's important to also remember that it's not a charter issue. I think we have a problem with teacher turnover in CPS. And then I think there's a trade-off that was part of the charter bargain, where charter principals and leaders are given the option to have more flexibility with how they staff, how they structure their model, and with that they have a different setup with teachers. That's the model. I also think it's wrong that there aren't teacher-led charter schools today. That's just wrong. There are. So Montessori School of Englewood, we were just talking about, is a new-ish school, opened 2 years ago, that Dr. Hoffman is on the board of. That was started by teachers. Many of the schools within networks that are being painted as sort of this like corporate takeover, many of those schools are started by individual teachers that are just as passionate as teachers who have started individual standalone charter schools and maybe just believers in something that has worked and want to be part of that. And so I think it's completely wrong that there are no more teacher-run charter schools.
So about 25% of the teachers at charter schools in Chicago do belong to the AFT local. That's the Alliance of Charter School or Charter Teachers and Staff. That's local 4343 of the American Federation of Teachers. And so those teachers actually have a contract. They have job protections. They have a set of due process. Teachers that are not part of collective bargaining units are at-will employees. And so when you have a situation in which you can be fired for any reason, then there are some very strange policies that come out of this. I know that at one charter network, if 10% of your students don't pass the AP exam, you can be fired, which creates a very interesting situation on the student's performance directly correlates to your job performance. Now, if you have students who can barely read when they start your AP class, and you move them a very significant portion to do very well at writing, reading, or math, whatever it might be, but you're fired because you didn't get to a standard that they were never able to get to in the first place, that this explains why there may be a lot of significant job concerns in a charter school. And so our belief is that if here in Oak Park, where the average teacher tenure right now is 14 years, where there's very stable teacher population, where there's high engagement, and that the community wants that to be the case. They want, that communities around, primarily in suburban areas, want very stable staffs that are experienced, so in 4th grade who your 5th grade teacher, your 6th grade teacher, your 7th grade teacher is. That's the ideal, and that's not happening in very many traditional Chicago public schools for a whole variety of reasons, and in charter schools as well. And so we need to get to that stability model rather than one that's constant churn.
How can we change the discourse to increase public support for all public schools instead of disrespecting the efforts of each sector?
I think it's...
Oh, okay, I'll repeat it. How can we change the discourse to increase public support for all public schools instead of disrespecting the efforts of each sector?
I think one way is to have more conversations that are about what's working for kids. So I started to mention earlier the recent CPS graduation rate data that came out. So CPS increased their graduation rate by 4% points over the past year. But if you look at the past 6 years, they've increased, CPS schools have increased from like 59% to 70-something%. It's very impressive. And that is a story that involves the charter sector and the traditional sector. Charter schools at the beginning of that period, if you look at the last 6 years, there were, I think, 27 charter charter high schools in Chicago at the beginning of that period. At the end, there were 45. At this point, charter school students, high school students, represent almost a quarter of the high school students in CPS. So part of that story involves charter schools, but that's not all. The traditional, if you actually parse out the data, the charter rate increased, but the traditional rate also increased. And so why? Why don't we have a conversation about what's going on across any school, whether it's charter or traditional? Is it freshmen on track? What did they do about that? You know, is it something about the college prep focus at some of these charter schools? Is there a belief gap that started to be closed because of the proof that's being actually made that more students can graduate and succeed? And so, you know, and we at INCS have done this. We've had panel discussions and neighborhood forums where we bring together charter leaders and district leaders and talk about practices like college going, what's working for you, how do you help your alumni stay in school, and those have been robust conversations that are wonderful. So I encourage us all to do that more.
It's actually a question that goes beyond just a type of school, right? A type of school organization. What's happened in public education writ large, especially since No Child Left Behind, has been this coordinated and concerted effort to blame schools and blame school staffs for terrible performance, to try to scare people into taking very draconian actions. At the same time, that the actual quality of education, when you look at it, has improved in very many ways during that period of time. And so you can't continue to say something's broken, and demoralize the people who work in that space, and then expect somehow to get better results. Scaring people and doing a very extrinsic, draconian kind of motivation is not the way to go. And so if we're going to change the discourse, the first thing we have to do is we have to stop blaming teachers, school professionals, and staffs for that somehow it's their fault that they didn't solve poverty, that they didn't solve the effects of poverty, that they didn't solve for the effects of segregation, that they didn't solve for the effects of a global financial crisis. Like, these are things that we can't solve with schools. Now, what can we do? We can make sure that schools have sufficient resources, that teachers are valued, that the staffs are valued, teachers, paraprofessionals, et cetera, that we change the way we look at schools. Now, this is not by any means a monolithic discussion. The places where this is happening most intensively is in urban cities where the students are coming with the most challenges. And so if we actually step back and say, wait a second, these kids are coming from very difficult circumstances and are still succeeding. That is something to be celebrated, not something to be blamed because they didn't do something perfectly.
Specifically, what legislation would you like to see the Illinois General Assembly adopt concerning charter schools? In addition to these 4 areas you've been talking about, are there others you feel are of imminent importance? Ms. McAuliffe, looks like you want to jump in.
I'd be happy to. One flaw of the charter law in Illinois is that it doesn't address facilities. And so in Illinois, in many states, there are facility provisions for charter schools in some way. It looks different from state to state, but in Illinois, there's not. And so charter schools end up spending a great deal of their attention, but also their money, which is per pupil money, which is meant to be spent on the classroom, and students end up having to think about how to raise money or otherwise generate revenue to pay for their facilities, which is just a hardship and requires this raising of money more than is necessary, and in order to still deliver the same results. And so we would like to see legislation that addresses that. We'd also like to see legislation that addresses the funding gap between traditional public schools and charter public schools. So right now, charter public schools receive less per student than traditional public schools. And in the law, in fact, there's a permissible gap going down to 75%, whereas charter school public school student can receive 75 cents on the dollar versus what a traditional public school student receives when, you know, as we all know, these students might live next door to each other. It's fundamentally unequal and is a problem. So that's probably our #1 priority in Springfield.
I mean, yeah, be careful, legislators, especially about the funding gap. There's been a lot of stuff from the charter school establishment about this funding gap. And I've done a national study on charter school finance in 2010, and I found there is in fact a funding gap. And other studies have confirmed between 20 and 27% funding gap. Charter schools receive less money from public sources than traditional public schools. But when we looked at expenditures, we could explain that because charter schools can get more money, but they have to serve more students with severe and moderate disabilities. They're disadvantaged, especially on categorical fundings. Traditional. There's a lot of categorical funding. You don't get funding for special ed unless you serve children with special needs. You don't get some of the federal dollars for vocational ed programs unless you have a vocational line. You don't get money for transportation, I hope, if you don't provide transportation. But when we looked at nationally, the data, it showed that most of the difference was in expenditures on special education and student support services and transportation. Those things accounted for the biggest gap. And so the good news, again, charter schools can get more money, but they have to serve more students with special needs, and they have to offer broader programs because then they can tap into those categorical fundings. Nobody's saying that they can't tap into more special ed dollars. They can.
I'm talking about a gap that comes, I'm talking about the general state funding, pre-categoricals, there's a gap. So you're starting off behind the starting line if you're a charter school before the categoricals even get factored in on either side in Illinois.
That law actually doesn't need to be changed for the vast majority of charter schools. The overwhelming majority of charter schools are in the city of Chicago, and it is equalized between charter school students and traditional public school students in CPS. The reason for the gap had to do a lot with in-kind services, and so if the district was providing outside of Chicago, if the district was providing, say, cafeteria services, or was providing transportation, or was providing facility support, that may actually have an in-kind dollar value that wasn't actually attached to the per pupil revenues that would go to a charter school, and so it's a little more complicated than saying there's this huge spread, because that huge spread was actually designed to allow for flexibility for districts and for charter schools to be able to come to agreements to open and to operate charter schools. In terms of potential legislation, there's a very interesting loophole in the Illinois charter school law that says any charter school that was in existence prior to 2003 can open up any number of campuses. It could open up 1,000 campuses, and it would count as one charter school. So you have huge charter school chains that the law technically says you can only have 70 or 75 charter schools in Chicago, but we have 130 charter campuses in the city of Chicago, and that number continues to expand. And so if you're going to honestly count the number of charter schools, you need to address that loophole that allows those schools that what's known as replication can continue to replicate and not count against the cap.
And just to be clear, there are less than 15 of those, and they are subject actually to authorization. So they can't just decide to open a school. They have to go through the very same process that other charter schools have to go through, applying to the district or appealing to the commission if they're not approved by the district.
Final word time. What would you like us to take away tonight? We'll start with Dr. Hoffman.
I guess I would like to point to some of the issues that that haven't been discussed, which, although I'm sitting here as as the founder of a charter school, I have profound concerns about the impact of the charter school movement. One is about the erosion of local democracy. And the second is about the built-in attack on the labor union movement. I think that the charter school movement is actually a collection of very strange bedfellows, some of whom I am not happy to be associated with, and among those are people who have use the charter school movement as a Trojan horse for destroying the labor unions. So those are issues that that have not come up as part of the questions and as part of the discussion, but I think they need to be out there in the conversation about charter schools.
Thank you, Dr. Moran.
I'll just come back to the issue of who stole my charter school reform. Mm-hmm. I like charter schools. I like the charter school idea, but I'm really unhappy with what the direction this reform has taken. Initially, there was very broad bipartisan support for charter schools in the state. And I think what's happened over time is that we call them charter schools, and sometimes I'm very frustrated because I know what we're really talking about are corporate schools or franchise schools. But the charter school idea is a great idea. I think if we're going to get broader support, we need to get more community involvement in these schools. Charter schools were envisioned to be small, locally run, new public schools, highly accountable, innovative. These are some of the ideas embedded in the legislation. And yet today we have decisions being made about our local charter schools from California or wherever the corporate headquarters are. And yes, there's differences between the nonprofit EMOs and the for-profit EMOs, but when we look at their contracts, we see management fees and we see structures and decision-making authority very similar. They have very similar contracts, many of them. So I think one of the things I'd like to see is more community support, and that's going to address a number of the issues about the tension or discourse. And perhaps with more community support, we're going to see greater collaboration between traditional public schools and charter schools.
I would counter the notion that there's been an erosion in democracy as a result of charter schools when parents deciding to send their students to a school that they're choosing is fundamentally the most direct public participation you can imagine in a public service. So I think it's wrong to suggest that these are anti-democratic. And I would also just suggest, charter schools have been painted on this panel as kind of corporate takeovers, as places where you have miserable teachers who are, being fired at random. There's been a lot of negative portrayals. I would just like to ask how many people here have been to a charter school? And anyone who hasn't, I'd like to invite you to visit, talk to the leader, spend some time looking at it, exploring it. If you are considering charter schools as a policy, it's very challenging to do so, having never gone to one. So please contact me, contact Inks, if you'd like help in getting that set up.
I had a college professor who was fond of saying, choice is democracy for those without power. And so unless you have a way to actually exercise some active involvement in deciding the role of how your schools operate, that we can't view just assuming that charter school expansion will fix the ills of education, especially urban education, is a myth. Now, that's not to say that I want to have every single charter school closed. I don't want to see any of them closed. What I want to see is actually improve the schools that exist right now, and that we do so in a way that actually recognizes that that a policy that pits schools against one another is a policy decision that is going to ultimately cause more harm than it does benefit. And so if we can stop and slow down that policy that forces people to choose sides in a debate that ultimately leads to very bad outcomes, then we need to value the school staff and school personnel in those buildings, adequately invest in education, make sure that the people who go into teaching as a field are valued as professionals and are adequately trained and supported, and that there's no magic bullet solution to education reform. It takes hard work, dedication, a lot of time, a lot of collaboration, and it's a messy process, kind of like democracy. And that if we're going to get better at it, we actually have to have a commitment rather than sort of grasp at straws whenever something shiny comes by.
I want to express my appreciation. We have some outstanding speakers that you've heard from tonight. Rather than creating a speakers bureau, we decided to sponsor this panel discussion and make the tape available. So please do, once we tell you exactly how you can obtain it, please do share this with your leagues as they study the issue. Thank you all for coming, and thank you particularly to our panel.
Yeah, there are a couple of really exciting programs coming up in Arlington Heights and in Oak Park in the coming weeks. We'll have information about it on the back table, and I urge you to check the State League website for additional information. Okay.